Gloria and welcome back to another video. This is my first video filming since coming back from my big 2-week trip. I went to the UK for a couple weeks with my husband and we had an amazing time. I'm going to talk a little bit about that experience in this video because this is the Traveling with Books tag. The original creator of this book tag is the lovely Gina Stanier and I was tagged by Shelley Swearingen. And towards the end of the video, I'll show you the books that I acquired on my trip. So a little mini book haul as well. If you want more details of the actual trip, a vlog is coming soon. It's just taking a little bit longer to edit. And also I've been posting on Instagram, so I have stories and posts on there, but vlog coming soon. Now to get into the questions, let's start it off with number one, do you read when you travel? Yes, of course I do. I read on this last trip, and if I think about the last, I don't know, 5 big trips I've been on, I think I read in every single one of them, some more than others. It all just depends on the trip. If it's a bigger trip with longer travel days, there's every intention, of course, to read on those travel days. If it's a plane flight, sometimes it's easier for me to just watch a TV show or movie. I can sometimes get a little motion sickness on planes, so it's sometimes harder to read and I'll just focus on watching a screen. But if it's a shorter trip with a ton planned or a lot of socializing, I probably won't be reading on the actual trip because there's just not enough time. So it all depends on the trip, but from this previous trip, I did get to read a little bit on the plane and during some evenings when I was experiencing some serious jet lag in the middle of the night and needed to read something to just pass the time. Question 2 is, do you travel with paper books or physical books? In previous trips I have, but in this last trip I did not. I was very constrained with space. It was a 2-week trip and all I brought was a small carry-on bag and a backpack. I just didn't have room to bring physical books with me. On a previous trip that I went with my husband to Mexico, it was a lot less constrained in the suitcase, and so I was able to bring like a physical book with me. Previous trips I brought a couple books with me. In an ideal world, I'd probably bring at least 1 book with me depending on the length of the trip and where I'm going and the mode of transportation. Which goes well into question 3 is, do you travel with an e-reader? And yes, I did. I traveled with, this is actually the case, but I traveled with my Kindle on this last big trip. This is the only thing that I brought with me, and I loaded this up with about 15 to 20 library books, and so whatever I was in the mood for at the time, I was able to use this, and this also helped with my jet lag middle of the night reading. It's very light and small, so this was the only book that I brought with me on my 2-week UK adventure. I also did have my phone and had about 15 to 20 audiobooks as well for options. I did a lot less audiobook listening, but a little bit. I've kind of already answered question 4, how many books do you pack when you travel? In an ideal world, 1 to 2, but on this last trip, none, just my Kindle. E-readers in general are new for me this year. I don't think I ever see myself traveling without one, just because it is small, it is light, and I use Libby religiously, and so I have access to tons of ebooks. I'd rather just put a bunch on there and just travel with this little thing than a physical book if I'm saving space. Question 5 is, does where you go or how long you are traveling impact the amount and the type of books that you take? Yes and no. It doesn't impact because whatever I'm usually in the middle of, and if my trip is starting, I'm gonna try to finish that book. For example, I was buddy reading the Poisonwood Bible with Shelley and Tiffany, and I wanted to finish that book on my trip, so I finished it on my plane ride over. It was just whatever book I was in the middle of. And then really for the rest of my trip, I didn't put any pressure on myself to have to buddy read anything or read any certain kind of book. I didn't really have a September TBR or end of August TBR. Again, I just loaded up my Kindle with a ton of different possibilities. However, because I was going to the UK, I was really in the mood for any books that have to do with the UK. So before I left, I went through my want to read list, picked out books that felt right, felt like I wanted to read while I was there maybe, found them on Libby, got them onto my Kindle or my phone as audiobooks, and just had a bunch available for me to see what I wanted to pick up. As I've grown as a reader, I've become either a more seasonal reader or a more mood reader depending on where I'm going. So if I'm traveling, I probably am in the mood to maybe read something about the place I'm traveling, not necessarily nonfiction, but even fiction set in that time and place. So still a mood reader, but maybe with some parameters, I don't know. And question 6 is, do you buy books when traveling or visit bookshops and libraries? Yes, 100%. I visited so many bookshops, probably not as many as I would have liked to or that were on my original list, but as many as I could squeeze in with also not completely boring my husband. We were in places for limited amounts of time, and so there was a lot to see and do, but I did squeeze in some bookshops and I did buy some books, which I'll show you in a minute. I didn't specifically seek out any libraries on this last trip, but I have visited certain cities before where visiting the library in that city would kind of be awesome to see, like visiting the New York City Public Library or the Library of Congress when I was in DC. So sometimes I've gone to libraries if they are kind of a main thing to see in the area. If I'm stateside and or doing a road trip, I will try to squeeze in stopping by little free libraries. I have the app, I use the map, and whenever we're just driving through some new part of town, I'll try to look up if there's any little free libraries around. Usually on road trips, I'm not constricted with space, so I can find however many books I want and try to take them home. Now, for the book haul from this last little trip, I set myself a 5-book limit, meaning I could only take 5 books home with me. And I actually ended up finding 8 and squeezing them in, but I did leave behind a pair of shoes. I brought 2 pairs of shoes with me, and one were completely falling apart and destroyed by the end of the trip, and they were already an older pair of shoes. So I had no problem just leaving them behind to try to fit in a few more books. That being said, let me take you through the 8 books that I found. The very first book that I purchased is 3 Hours by Rosamund Lupton. This has been a mystery thriller that has been on my to-read list for over a year now, but it was only released in the UK, maybe Canada, and I just didn't have access to the book in the US. I could have purchased it on Amazon, but anyways, it was on my list. This isn't my favorite cover, but it doesn't matter. I wanted this book. This was my one book that I was like on the hunt for when I was there, and I bought this at Foyles in London, which is at a big book chain, I think, like a Barnes & Noble, and it was really fun to peruse and try to find this one. In that same bookshop, I also found Gray Bees by Andrei Kurkov. This was a book that came on my radar earlier this year, kind of in the late springtime. This is a translated book. The author is Ukrainian. This book was written a couple years ago, but it is about a fictitious war between Russia and Ukraine and just all of the war, conflict, and propaganda that would go along with that. And this just is very fitting to read with what recent events have happened in this last year. And of course, bees is in the title. I have a thing with books about bees. So this book is really like epitomizing everything that I want to read in a book. It might be a little bit too literary for me, but I am willing to give it a go. The next 2 books I found in a used bookstore in the city of Bath in England. And I just walked by the store and I saw that it was used books, and I went inside and I was so tempted to take more home with me. But I really just restricted myself to 2 books. All the books there were £1 or £2. They had a huge classics collection as well. They had a ton of DVDs and records, but I found these 2 books. The first one is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I own Parable of the Sower by this author, and I've been meaning to read that. This is also another one of her books that I've heard nothing but amazing things about. This is about a Black woman who travels back in time into 19th century Maryland, where slave ownership was still very much the trend. And so I think she's set on kind of some mission to save someone and deal with that. Again, nothing but amazing things, so I can't wait to read it. This next book that I found solely because of the title, Salt and Honey by Candy Miller. Had never heard of this book before, but I thought the cover was beautiful. And this is a historical fiction set during the apartheid in South Africa, which I have only read a few books about that time period and that tension, and they were amazing. And so I'm excited to try this one out, about a woman just trying to survive and deal with that whole experience during that time period. So I am very excited to give this one a go and add it to my bee and honey collection. Also in the city of Bath, I found another bookshop that was probably my favorite from this whole trip. It was called Mr. B's Emporium of Reading Delights, and it was just a delight of a bookshop, really adorable. I didn't really know what to buy. Again, I don't buy new books very often. I much prefer used bookstores and kind of just seeing what treasures I'll find. But I really did want to support that shop and buy something, and I found The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arman. This is a book that recently hopped onto my TBR. I was hoping to read it in spring, but didn't get to it, but I'll save it for next spring. And it is just a lovely, beautiful classic, and I believe it's about a group of women who like rent some villa in Italy and just have a good time, and it's about female friendship. It's a classic that was originally published in the 1920s, so I was excited to add this one to my collection and support that adorable bookstore. And lastly, I found 3 books in a used bookstore in Galway, Ireland. The first one is Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys. This was a Ruta Sepetys that I did not own, that I have read, and so I was excited to find it in used but pretty good condition for just a couple bucks as well. And I don't love this cover, but I much prefer this one over the US edition anyways. And these 2 were not used, but they were on sale for just a couple pounds. They're both like the Penguin pocketbook size. They're tiny little books, but I found The Dubliners by James Joyce. and My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. Now for the Dubliners, I don't know too many details except that this is a collection of stories and I think an important book of Irish literature. And so since I was in Ireland, I thought I need to snag this one up. And especially it being a short story collection, I would probably much prefer to read this book physically than try to attempt an audiobook. And then for My Family and Other Animals, I don't know anything about this except Mitzi from Reads and Writes recently raved about this book and I was familiar with the title from her review, and so I thought I would snag it as well. I think this is about a British family that goes to a Greek island and some shenanigans goes on. It's supposed to be very fun and lighthearted and sweet and heartwarming, and so I am all about that. So these are the 8 books that I acquired on my UK trip. One regret I have was not buying a book from Scotland because I feel like that would have been nice to round it out, but I ran out of room and that's okay. I'm happy with the ones that I did find. As always, let me know if you've read any of them or any of your thoughts below. And then finally, to close out this video, number 7 for the traveling with books tag was to tag some fellow travelers and booktubers who would maybe answer these questions. The first traveler I'd like to tag is Teacup the Storyteller. She actually currently lives in Scotland and I believe did some recent traveling to visit her family. I would also like to tag Nyx Reads. I know she also did some recent summer traveling. Bookworm Adventure Girl, of course, because you are a fellow travel lover and have been all over. And finally, Well Traveled Books, because she's also a big traveler in Europe and Canada, and travel is in your booktube name, so it's very fitting. No pressure, ladies, but I would love to see you answer these questions. And thank you all for watching and tuning in, and for all of those that commented on my travels while I was there. It was a really fun trip, and like I mentioned, vlog coming soon for those that have been asking for it. I'll see you guys in another video soon. Bye!